Hi, hello, how are you? So, fairies. Very popular. Very popular. But also like quite infamous in our modern witchcraft community, right? And paganism at large. And I think that a lot of people have kind of given into this hive mind mentality about what fairies are, and I don't think it's correct. In my personal experience with the Fae, it's not correct. I think a lot of what we assume to be attributes of the fairies come from Tinkerbell, and Tinkerbell herself comes from Victorian era views of fairies. So, we hear about fairies a lot being like the wee folk, right? Being little bitty people with wings or without wings, but they're very little and they're very mischievous and rambunctious, almost toddler like. And that's not a thing like until we get to like the 1800s. And I just think that's interesting that has become the prevalent view of what a fairy is in modern culture. Whereas I find that the older versions of what a fairy is in the Fae at large is much more fascinating. Much more fascinating. So, fairy itself, first of all, is like a Italian term from fata or fata, and it means fate. And so these are beings to the Italians that are tied to the concept of fate, which doesn't sound anything like the British fairies or the Celtic fairies that we're used to when we think of fairies. So I think that's an important distinction there, because to me, an Italian fata is something totally different than a fae, or than a fairy. It is a fae, but we'll get into that. But it's something different. They preside over different things. So, when we say fae, the fae is a blanket term for all kinds of spirits, not just fairies. It's a blanket term for fairies, pixies, gnomes, elves, goblins, brownies, a lot red caps, a lot of things. You can even throw in Merrows and mermaids into that. Some people do as the fae. So these are like humanoid spirits, essentially, just point blank, right? The fae are humanoid, and when we say humanoid, beings that appear with human features or in human bodies, albeit sometimes a little different. So that's the fae, blanket term. Within the fae, we have fairies, or fairies. And as we see them today, that does come from Britain, right? That view. Now, if we go back further, we start seeing before the influence of the word fairy, right, from the Italians, we see words like she, right, thrown around. Sidhe, she. And that is like a primarily Irish Gaelic word. And it just means a mound. And it's usually a burial mound that people, they're buried under. A burial mound, a she. And these entities, there are these spirits that are associated with them called the she. And which is the same name as the burial mound itself. But this name is also applied to the Irish Celtic gods. The Tuatha De Danann are also called the she. And then that becomes a blanket term as well, where she begins to encompass any kind of like spirit, just a spirit, in the British Isles, in the Celtic, pan-Celtic culture. And so if the gods are fairies themselves, or if the gods are fae, that's, which is generally accepted in Celtic paths, that's really cool, because then you're automatically working with the Fae whether you realize it or not. But then when you start saying that the Celtic gods are Fae, are she, that has to completely change your view of what the Fae or the fairies are, because you have someone like Morgan Le Fay, you have someone like Morgan Le Fay, or the Morgan, who is a Fae, right? By textbook definition, next to somebody like Dagda or Ogma, or Lou, Jack and the Green, Cernunnos. You have all these. Suddenly, you have people that are very different from each other, very different types of spirits, but they're all being called Fae or she. So that's interesting. I think what's particularly interesting is that also in the like Victorian era, Edwardian era, we get this idea of the Seelie and the Unseelie courts of Fae or of fairies, and also sometimes it's just elves. And that just basically means Seelie is the good, benevolent fairies, and Unseelie is the bad, malevolent fairies. Meh. You can take that if you want. I really don't. But again, that's such a much later addition to the mythology. And I like to usually just pull from like the most original sources that I can. So, Pixies. Pixies and fairies are sometimes equated as the same thing. But in my opinion, they are not. They're more like cousins, right? And in like some Welsh myths that I have found, pixies or piskies are, you could equate them and say they are fairies, definitely, but they seem to be much more on the side of sometimes being tricksters, maybe bad, untrustworthy. They're more full of shenanigans, in my opinion, than a fairy. So if you want to say the Seelie and Unseelie court thing, I guess I would say that fairies are Seelies and pixies are Unseelies. However, not really true. I'm generalizing here and speaking from my experiences. I think it's cool too that in the original, in some older myths and tales about fairies and pixies in particular, we see that they're described as fair, right? So, like, that brings to the image of, like, oh, they must be blue-eyed and white-skinned and blonde-haired, but not necessarily. They are just fair. That doesn't even necessarily mean complexion. Okay? So we have, and they're always usually beautiful, sometimes grotesque, but usually beautiful. But there's always a tale about them that shows you that they're not human because they look so human when they come to you. They're either usually a little bit too tall than a normal person, or they're a little bit shorter than a normal person. Or maybe they have a color of eye that is not of a normal person. So maybe they have orange eyes or purple eyes. That's a tell. You'd be like, something different going on. Sometimes they have two different colored eyes. They can shapeshift at will, and this is told in the tales. They're shapeshifters, so they're not confined to a tiny image or a giant image. They can be anything. They can be any gender. They can shapeshift their genders. In my opinion, most fae in general, to blanket term them all, do not have a baseline image of what they look like. They are completely fluid beings of energy. They don't have a base form. They don't have one look that they go with. So essentially, all fae are genderless and are imageless until they decide to sculpt one. But that's just me. But in the tales, we do see that they, like I said, they are shapeshifters, like master shapeshifters, and they're usually pretty much always benevolent. They only will do you wrong if you do them wrong, which is just like a human. Just like a human. In my experience, the fae at large do really love offerings. There are some that in the tales do not like offerings, such as the brownie, The brownie is a spirit that is usually described as very small in stature and usually very ugly, but very kind-hearted. And they pick a family or a person that they really like, and they do deeds for you. Be them physical deeds or magical deeds. They send you energy. They send you money. You know what I mean? They protect you. But they pick you out. You don't pick them. They pick you. But a brownie does this selflessly. Like, it doesn't want you to return the favors. So there are stories of families catching a glimpse or out of the corner of their eye of the brownie scuffling around the house, like doing something, and they're like, "Oh, there's the brownie that's helping our family," and they'll leave out a plate of an offering for it, and the brownie gets really upset and it leaves. It's like, deuce. And maybe that's true. I've not worked with brownies really at all. Not really. So I don't know if that's necessarily true for all brownies, but certainly it must be true for at least some brownies. And probably for some fae at large. Maybe there are some faes who don't like offerings. But in my experience, they all like offerings. They love it. Milk and honey is a classic. It is a very good offering. Spices, in my experience, are really loved by the fae that I work with. They love them. Like, just laying out I have these little plastic cauldrons. Just laying those out, or even a saucer, and just putting herbs for them to explore. So, like, and sometimes it'll be simple herbs like celery seed, salt, and pepper, but things like that. But like, I like to give them something exotic sometimes that might not be something that they're used to. Since I'm working with Celtic fae, so I like to lay out like curry powder, paprika, something a little different for them. It usually sprinkled in with something easy for something familiar for them too, like coriander. But spices are very popular with the fae. Milk and honey, sometimes alcohol. You can leave out an offering of beer, of vodka, gin. I find that they really love gin. But gin, rum, I mean, you could do anything. I find that the fairies are so interested by human culture, they want to partake in it any way that they can. And if you're lucky, they let you partake in theirs. And that's where we get into like mystery traditions with the fae. I find that when you start working with the fairies, you start learning certain little techniques when it comes to magic. Little tweaks to things that maybe you never thought of or have ever read in a book before. Just these little things of inspiration pop into your mind, and like you think that is so left field from what I would normally do, but it feels so powerful when you do it. You're like, oh, I feel blocks releasing. Like, fairies will share their mystery traditions with you once you start building a rapport with them, and if they find that you're genuinely working with them out of enjoyment and pleasure of their of their presence, not just to get something from them. If you're just trying to get something from them, they're not going to work with you. They're not. They're going to see that before you even start. Now, there are a lot of books about fairies and the fae and how to work with them, and I find a lot of them to be garbage, honestly. They're so full of just misinformation and of this compounding down the idea that fairies are fickle, mean-spirited, something to be scared of, or on the flip side that fairies are dunce, airheaded, least of frank-looking images. And that is so not fae. That is not the fae. The fairies are not all garden gnome type people. Like, I find all that to be very insulting. And I'm being totally serious. Like, it's very insulting. I hate that kind of stuff. I hate it. So for me, the best place to start when you're wanting to journey down the path of working with the fae is to look at history, to look at the original myths and lore. Just good old-fashioned mythology books, Good old-fashioned books. Like just folktale and myth books like this are perfect. Look at fairy tales. They're called fairy tales for a reason. But folklore, myths of the Celtic lands, of all kinds of lands, depending on the type of fae you want to work with, they're the best place to start. And I feel like most of them are not going to be filled with this neo-pagan modern witch or new age bias or misinformation. But as always, don't take any one person's word for anything. Go discover the Fae for yourself and find out how you work with them and how you connect with them, because that's gonna be what's best for you. And I'm not saying that all modern books are bad. Don't get me wrong. I have some myself, but majority of them in my experience just are not great and are, like I said, full of a bunch of just crap. So I would consult just old classic mythology and folklore first before diving into anything. And this goes for fairies, this goes for mermaids, this goes for elves, this goes for everything. Yeah, that's just a little jumping off point for you for fairies or the Fae at large. And I'm someone who likes to go off the beaten path. So instead of just working with fairies, I like to discover the other spirits and characters of mythology and folklore that people leave out. Everyone wants to wants to devote themselves to the Morrigan. Everyone wants to learn about fairies. Great, but what about Pixies? What about Merrows? What about those? What about Lugh? What about Flittish? What about all these other gods and spirits that are ignored in the Celtic pantheon? That's what I find fascinating. So, anywho, ramble-ish kind of thing done. I'm going to link a video at the end of this, probably right now, about my work with the elves. I worked with the elves very closely when I was newish into the path, and I made a video about it. I'll link that at the end, as well as my video about different gods and goddesses in the Celtic pantheon. I'll link that as well. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to like this video. And don't forget to comment down below and tell me what you think about the Fae, and tell me what other videos you want to see, because I'll make them. Alright, you guys, have a great day. Goodbye.